President Bola Tinubu is asking Nigeria's political class to keep politics honorable and governance responsible, saying that contest ends when the oath of office begins. The president made the remarks at the State House in Abuja while pledging to build on the legacy of his predecessor, Muhammadu Buhari, during the launch of a new biography on the late former president.
A legacy is given greater meaning when those who follow choose to continue what has been started. That is my duty, my dear brother, President Muhammadu Buhari. Though you are no longer with us, your impact NGOs who will honor and build upon your legacy. Nation building demands that we complete passionately and we compete dispassionately. Govern responsibly. President Muhammadu Buhari understood that the contest ends when the oath begins. In his memory, let us keep our politics honorable and our governance focused on results.
In other news, the Supreme Court says Section 305 of the Constitution does not empower the President to suspend or dissolve a state's executive and legislative institutions during emergency rules, stressing that such actions are subject to judicial review. The ruling followed a suit by PDP-controlled states challenging President Bola Tinubu's declaration of a state of emergency in Rivers State. In March, Tinubu cited threats to peace, suspended Governor Siminalayi Fubara, his deputy, and the state lawmakers, and appointed a retired naval chief, Ibok Ete Ibas, as sole administrator. Although the court examined the merits of the case, it struck out the suit. In a majority judgment, the Apex Court held that the plaintiffs lacked locus standi and disclosed no cause of action, leading to its dismissal for want of jurisdiction. Justice Mohammed Idris said that while the president has discretion to declare a state of emergency, no arm or tier of government may usurp the powers of another, and emergency measures must remain within constitutional limits. In a minority judgment, Justice Obande Ogunya maintained that the president may declare a state of emergency but cannot suspend elected state officials, including governors, deputy governors, and legislators. Reacting to that judgment, the People's Democratic Party expressed concern, saying it has the potential to undermine Nigeria's democracy. The PDP insists that there is the need for clarity on the constitutional boundaries of emergency powers in Nigeria to prevent abuse and ensure the stability of the country's democracy. The party is calling on the National Assembly to initiate constitutional and legislative safeguards to define and limit the scope of emergency powers of the president. As Nigerians prepare for the holiday season, air travel costs have become a major talking point. Many passengers are confronted with significantly higher fares on popular routes, while less trafficked routes remain comparatively affordable. In some cases, fares have gone up as much as 300%. A one-way ticket airfare from Abuja to Anambra State stands at 500,000 naira. The disparity raises questions about airline pricing models, seasonal demand, operational costs, and regulatory oversight, all of which directly impact travelers' budgets and access to safe, reliable air transport. Well, the Minister of the Federal Capital Territory, Nyesom Wike, has restated his commitment to transforming Abuja into a world-class city with modern infrastructure and inclusive development for the indigenous people of Abuja. The minister made the pledge while being honored by Abuja indigents for his massive infrastructure development in outer city districts and satellite towns in the FCT. Arise News correspondent Abidemi Sikiru has more.
It's the annual homecoming events of the Gbagi people in Karu district, one of the satellite towns in the Federal Capital Territory, and many indigents from home and abroad are meeting to take stock of the outgoing year 2025. The special guest of honor here is the FCT Minister, Nyesom Wike, who is being represented by his Chief of Staff, Chidi Amadi, and other top leaders in the delegation, including a son of the soil and former minority leader of the 8th Senate, Senator Philip Aduda. Wike, in his message to the gathering, affirmed that his administration remains focused on delivering impactful projects that will improve the quality of life of residents and indigents of the Federal Capital Territory.
Some of the laudable achievements of the present administration as it impacts Karo. It is only a thing of joy, and we continue to thank God that it does appear that the time for Karo people has come.
In his remarks, Senator Philip Aduda, Igbagi and Sons of Karo community urged Abuja residents to embrace unity, peaceful coexistence, and took time to explain some policies of the FCT minister to his people.
We all come together and unite to work together for the progress of our dear town, our dear children, Karo, so that we can continue to achieve meaningful progress.
Earlier on, Chairman of the Karubagi Development Association explained that the homecoming gathering is an annual event that promotes unity and peaceful coexistence among Abuja indigents and residents.
We have 3 programs that we designed here. We designed scholarship, then we designed small support for businesses and artisans, and then of course this food distribution and condiments for the aged. Now the idea is to see how we can support those who are not able to get any means to be strengthened in the society, because we can't continue to depend on government alone.
The program also featured the presentation of awards to outstanding Gbagi people who have contributed significantly to the development of Karo, including the FCT minister for his huge road reconstruction, bus terminal construction, water supply projects, and other infrastructural developments in Karo district. Abidimi Sikiru, Arise News.
All right, Rufai, Dr. Abati, we have a number of stories before us this morning. Of course, the Supreme Court ruling on the state of emergency in River State is top of our mind. It's one of the stories that's making the headlines this morning, as well as the launch of a 606-page book, biography of the former President Muhammadu Buhari, and President Tinubu's speech there. Nyesom Wike, Minister of FCT, also in the news this morning, as well as amongst other stories. Your take on this story?
So congrats to all the awardees. Congrats to Nyesom Wike. Congrats to, I think I could say our own Somna Sambo, and a couple of other people that got the award from, I think, the Gbagi community there in Abuja. I'd like to quickly delve into the Supreme Court ruling. Kudos to the dissenting judge, Obande, right?
Obando Guinya.
Ogbonna. He showed a lot of courage, and he showed the capacity to be able to say it the way it is. But it doesn't crown the Supreme Court in glory, because this was a case that ought to have been heard long ago. But they also now dragged it till the end, after the state of emergency. In fact, I remember I did dare them that if they had heard that case, I'll be shocked while the state of emergency went on. But no. It was months after that they heard the case. I think the first determination is what I want more clarity on while the case was struck out, that there was no cause of action. And I'm asking, please, maybe they, our lords in the court, can define this cause of action. Because I remember, this was the same Supreme Court that took on the case when the CBN did do a Naira redesign. And state governments took the federal government to court. And the Supreme Court assumed jurisdiction. And I think the argument then was that it affected the citizens. In my own interpretation, I think the import of the Supreme Court, or the states taking the Supreme Court to court on this Rivers matter, also will affect the citizens of the states in a case where the matter is not determined. So the Supreme Court determining cause of action technicality to strike out the case, I want more debates and more clarity on it. Because this was the same Supreme Court that took on the case of Naira redesign, which the CBN which we said had powers too. And they even gave sterling orders to extend the duration of Naira redesign to be able to call in your currency because it affected the people. When you look at the import of the state of emergency, it also does affect the states and the people and the governance of the state. So when the Supreme Court said there was no direct cause of action, I want more clarity on that. Like I said, I might be a nepios in this matter. Secondly, the Supreme Court tried to make, yes, determination, because that was not the substantive matter, but in about the 14 pages they released, they talked about the fact, and I think this day called it rightly, when he talked about the fact that you cannot unilaterally make those decisions after a determination of the state of emergency as regards democratically elected people in the states. In fact, the Supreme Court is an analogy, gave a pictorial look at what happens in India and Pakistan, and finally arrived that the reason why they didn't put a definition to the extraordinary circumstance is that they wanted the powers of the president to also be discretionary, but they said the Constitution also puts a bulwark by saying that despite the power might be discretionary as regards Section 305, it must now also go to the judiciary. To the legislature to make determination. But for me, I have problems with that. And I think these are things we need to be able to look at in the Constitution, because I am not sure that the drafters of the Constitution ever envisaged that there will be a day that the legislature will be in bed and be a rubber stamp to the executives. So when you are saying that the checks and balance of the legislative conduct for the president's extraordinary powers in the state of emergency to be taken to the legislature, just know that the case is a fait accompli. And that was what happened in the case of Rivers. Because the president here truly took it to the legislature. And what did the legislature do? As rubber stampers, they were endorsed any level of illegality. In fact, the Supreme Court finally talked about even the voting patterns. You must have a division who was able to write the names of people that voted in that regard, but the Senate, if you remember, did a voice vote as regards and just endorsed it. So I think this matter will still be looked at, maybe in further dates. It's going to be off for more determination. But the Supreme Court, put some clarity and also respected the law, the role of the legislature in acting as a balancing act. But in Nigeria's case today, it's not practical because the legislature is in bed, it's a rubber stamp to the executive.
Okay, I've written an extensive comment on this subject on the back page of this day newspaper today. So I'll just try to summarize parts of that commentary that will seem relevant for television. The first thing I think is that it's very important that their lordships, when they deliver judgments on constitutional matters, speak with clarity and certainty, and that there is no ambiguity in what they say, to the extent that fishermen, mechanics, all kinds of roadside commentators can then, interpret what they have done broadly. It's the Supreme Court itself, in this matter, that has brought this odium upon itself, where it is being apparently misinterpreted. Because the Supreme Court, in the lead majority judgment delivered by Justice Mohammed Idris, who seem to have spoken with both sides of the mouth. And so, laymen, the generality of laymen, will say maybe the court was speaking with kola nuts in its mouth. However, the judgment of the Supreme Court is clear enough. But we have a problem. What is out there in the public domain is a bench judgment, which is a summary of what the majority decided, 6-1. Nobody, as far as I know, has seen the judgment, the dissenting judgment by Justice Obunya. It will be necessary to place both side by side. But so we make preliminary comments so far. However, there have been cases in the past when a dissenting judgment can be more popular, more compelling than the lead judgment, as was the case in Samuel Jackson in Jackson versus Sunday Jackson versus the state, by Justice Helen Ogunwumi, JSC, as she then was. So what you find here, one of my observations is that one, whatever the Supreme Court has decided is basically an academic interpretation of Section 305. When you read the majority judgment by Justice Mohammed Idris, there's nowhere there where the judgment says, oh, President Tinubu can suspend democratic institutions. What that judgment says, which is in the public domain, is that one, Section 305 sub 3 offers the president discretion in determining the extraordinary measures that are mentioned in Section 305 C and D, sub 3 C and D thereof. Now, beyond that, they also say that, however, this discretion, the reason why the Constitution has not defined it is intentional, because the declaration of a situation of emergency is discretionary, is situational, and it does not follow a rigid formula. Now, what does that mean in legal terms? What it means is that the president can look at a situation and then on the basis of discretion decide that this is how he will apply the extraordinary measures. But they did not go far as to say categorically that the president can suspend democratic structures. They also agree, or they avert, that in India and Pakistan, the situation they have is that the president can just usurp the democratic structures. But in Nigeria, our constitution is silent on that. So this whole point about it is not a rigid formula, it is discretionary, the president can express his discretion, they now say is checked by the fact that the same constitution says you have the check and balance by the National Assembly that the president has to refer to. And that's where this danger is. If you have a government where the National Assembly is obliged to do whatever the president wants, what kind of outcome will you get? But I also raised other issues that, look, the interpretation is academic. This is after the fact. The people of Rivers State, youths, elders, and other stakeholders don't believe that that situation in Rivers State as at 2020, 2024, warranted what the president did. Second, the judgment is coming so long after the fact that it has been rendered technical and academic and intellectual. Most of the governors, 11 governors, went to court, PDP governors. They have all dissolved into the APC. So who is going to benefit? Should I keep quiet, producer? I'm trying to do an analysis and I've not finished. No. This is an important subject that you have brought. I would like to finish on my point. Now, many of those persons, they are no longer in the PDP. They have left. Osun State has gone to Accord. Other people have gone into the APC. The point that we need to make is simply this, that when the Supreme Court speaks, it should speak with certainty and with clarity. And that's why we will not have this kind of controversy. The media yesterday just jumped to conclusions, even when nobody has seen or read the judgment. Now we have read only the bench judgment of the Supreme Court. We have not seen this dissenting opinion. So it's important that, the judiciary itself looks at itself so that you don't have people complaining that this is an issue about the judiciary. Finally, one other point that was brought up is about the FCT minister saying that he's transforming Abuja. Yes, we expect him to transform Abuja, but the FCT minister in Nyesom Wike brings a lot of controversy. Controversy that, in my opinion, does not help the president. Controversy that, in my opinion, looks like using that office to target certain personalities in the country. The minister needs to pay attention to that.
All right, very quickly, because of our time, and I know that we have a guest, so we have two guests actually, where we have an opportunity to have a panel discussion around the Supreme Court judgment. As has already been established on this table, that judgment, because of perhaps the way it was delivered, or maybe when the certified true copy is out and we can see in detail and be able to dissect. But what has come out from it, I'll just pick out a few things. Having read also different viewpoints, on this particular subject matter. First of all was that the Supreme Court affirmed that the executive does not have the powers based on Nigeria's constitution to remove an elected official. That was substantive. However, it does mention the fact that, and I'll quote Justice Idris here, who was the lead on this six-man panel, and nevertheless, the president's discretion under Section 305 is not unfettered. He mentioned that emergency measures must be temporary, corrective, and proportionate. Now, based on that statement, they talk about the fact that the key word here is that the president, in his decision to institute a state of emergency in Rivers State, did not remove permanently this governor of Rivers State, the elected governor of Rivers State. So the contention here might then be, is it based on the fact that it was a temporary removal, it was a suspension as opposed to a removal? What are the extent of the powers of the president? And that's why I agree with the PDP in reacting to this, that whilst they accept the judgment of the Supreme Court, there's an onus on the National Assembly to clearly define and put in place safeguards to ensure that there are areas in the Constitution that are currently vague, giving room for abuse, to make it more definitive. For instance, can the president have the powers to suspend an elected official on the grounds of an emergency rule? Another contention, of course, which has been even before the ruling, is to what extent was there a threat of security breakdown in Rivers State to trigger an emergency rule by the president. This is still under contention, and this is still because one of the things that we must do, we've talked about how the Constitution makes provision for the powers of the president almost like an emperor, such that there are not enough checks and balances and safeguards to ensure that if the wrong person is in power or the wrong decision is taken, these powers cannot be curtailed. The reason why we have the three arms of government is to prevent a dictatorship. However, this is where we speak up for strong institutions and better safeguards, because in the event where there are issues with the executive, in the event where the legislature is in cohort or in agreement with the executive, in events where the judiciary itself, in this case that is supposed to be another arm to checkmate decisions like this and to uphold the tenets of democracy, is not clear in its judgment, then we have a challenge. I was very intrigued by Mahmoud Jaga's piece on this, and I'm glad that he'll be coming on the show very shortly, where he related this particular judgment to that made in 2008 based on the judgment around the extent of the powers of the executive. At that time, it was between President Obasanjo and Atiku, his vice, who had resigned and defected to another party, and whether or not the president could, by his powers, remove or state that an elected official would not be in power. And it was very clear in defining how or in what circumstance an elected official can be removed. Resignation, impeachment, incapacitation, or death, these still remain the same. However, the conversation will then be around permanence, suspension. Would the president have the powers to suspend, or the executive have the powers to suspend an elected official? Many areas around this. I'd have loved to also touch on the book launch and what the president said about President Muhammadu Buhari's legacy, but I believe in the course of today's show we might be able to talk about that. He mentioned a few things, and I believe that there are some areas that Nigerians might not agree with. The great thing about books like this is that it presents factual records of a man's legacies, but I do believe, and I'll end on this point, that the legacy of a man is best told by the lives of people that were affected. And so a lot of Nigerians might want to contribute perhaps to the history and the legacy left by the previous administration and person of the President Muhammadu Buhari government.